Professor Lazos, can you talk to us about the kind of influence that Justice Sonia Sotomayor may make on the Supreme Court? On what type of cases?
Right. Well, first of all, she's the first Latina justice, as we all know, and what it means to be Latino or Latina in the United States today is different than what it means to be an African American in the United States today. So I think that idea of a new minority, the growing, most populous minority that we have now, the minority that is now at the edge of many civil rights issues, it's going to be important to have that voice included. So for example, around immigration issues, we have roughly 30 to 40% of Latino families being in mixed families, meaning that they have at least one member who has a regular status in the United States, is a very important issue. We have many Spanish speakers, bilingual speakers in Latino families. And issues like education and access to health care are extremely important, since these are populations who are disadvantaged from a health insurance perspective. And also, education, as we all know, is the way up for any group in our society that is not in a middle class status, which is the situation with many Latinos today. So I think that unique perspective as a Latina is going to be very helpful to the court, for example, perhaps around language rights issues. Title VII law is underdeveloped, I believe, in the area of accent discrimination, and we have many Latinos and many Puerto Ricans, which Sotomayor is herself Puerto Rican, suffering language discrimination issues or accent discrimination issues, even being profiled, for example, because you have a slight accent as a Puerto Rican as being a non-citizen. So I think she'll be able to impart special attention to that. In the intersection of language rights and education, No Child Left Behind has a lot of statutory provisions that are supposed to make sure that ethnic minorities, language minorities are not left behind, which are not being vigorously enforced state by state. There might be litigation around that, and we may have a Judge Sotomayor be able to kind of impart her view as to how important it is to make sure that we have federal courts vigorously enforcing the statute, so there is a true remedy around the rights that are given by statute and under the law. She is our first colonial subject. She is a second-generation Puerto Rican, but her parents emigrated from Lajas, Puerto Rico, a very poor area of Puerto Rico, to New York City. And this issue that we have within our country of having certain jurisdictions that are not states, for example, the District of Columbia. We also have Guam, for example, which is a territory, the United States Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. What is the status of this group of citizens? They're quite numerous. Their citizenship status is supposed to be statutory, but there's also kind of the voting rights issue, and we've seen a little bit of this around the voting rights issue in District of Columbia. Should these U.S. citizens be able to vote in a more full and participatory manner, particularly around presidential elections? This may be an issue, and it's probably going to be an issue around D.C. voting rights that's going to come up through the courts. She is a woman, as we all know, but she's a female who has a non-traditional family. She divorced very early in her life. She lived with a gentleman that later they didn't get married. But I think this perspective of kind of the career woman who is not in the mom and dad and three little kids type of situation is also going to be helpful to the Supreme Court. So we may have kind of employment situations or discrimination issues, accessibility issues that she may be able to address and talk to the court about. I think also just in general, the fact that she is a trial judge or was a trial judge at one point in her career is going to make her pay more attention to the trial court record. And there have been a lot of commentary here recently about how the court is kind of making up facts on its own. There's a very kind of criminal procedure case that Dan Cahan wrote an article around called Whose Eyes, where actually the Supreme Court went back and looked at the videotape of the police chase and did not accept the trial record which was highly unusual in terms of how to decide a case. So it might be that a justice like Sotomayor, who's a very careful judge and really looks at the record, could shape up the court a little bit around these trial court, trial fact kinds of issues. Finally, I would say that I'm very encouraged by the fact that Justice Sotomayor sees herself as a conciliator, as someone who has a lot of confidence in her ability to approach people and justices who are not of her ilk, not of her ideology, not of her own background. I was very encouraged by the conversation that she had with our inspector, in which she was questioning and pushing her and saying, what about that Supreme Court? Don't you think that those oral arguments should be televised? And she says, yeah, generally I agree with what you're saying. How are you going to convince those other kind of hardcore conservative justices on the Supreme Court? Well, I would approach them, I would talk to them, I wouldn't give up, I would be friendly in my approach. And overall, her demeanor in the confirmation hearings was gracious, was patient, and was certainly approachable. She was very careful of addressing each senator on an individual basis and establishing some personal rapport. So the idea of having someone on the Supreme Court who is going to be collegial is encouraging, in the sense that I believe that the decision-making that the Supreme Court makes is always going to be improved by better conversations by the diverse justices and the justice cohort as a whole.
Okay, great. Professor Lazos, thank you.
Thank you.